Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and anyone anywhere above or in between. This is Virginia, and welcome back to my channel. I realized in my first video that I never actually said my name, so that's awkward. Just like me. Thank you so much for tuning in and checking out my second speed build. As you saw from the title of this video and that little intro, we are making Marilyn Monroe's famous Brentwood home. This was the only home that Marilyn actually owned outright, and it was a home that she sadly lost her life in. So throughout this video, as with the previous video, I will be talking a lot about the woman that owned this home, as well as the home and the build itself. But first, before we get into anything about Marilyn, I did just want to point out I have cut out a lot of this video. You'll see that a lot of the floor plan and things like that have been cut out because it took me a really long time. There are a lot of floor plans available online, but none of them are 100% identical to the other. So I kind of had to use my powers of deductive reasoning and what images I did have available from when Marilyn lived there to try and sort out this floor plan. And this is a private residence after Marilyn passed away. It was sold. Sadly, this is not a historical site like, some other builds I have done. So it is a private residence, you can't just go and tour it, and it has been renovated at least once, maybe twice. So the pictures that are available of the interior now, most of it is not the way it was when Marilyn lived there. And when I do these historic builds, I always like to try and make it as close to the aesthetic of the person that, the person of note that we're building this house based around. So I did have to weed through some images and kind of fudge things a little bit here and there because there's a very finite amount of images available from when Marilyn actually lived there because she didn't spend a lot of time in this house. She passed away in 1962, and I believe she bought this house that same year or late 61, early 62. So she was very excited about decorating this house. She was very excited about owning this house. And she is quoted as saying anyone that liked this house would they'd probably get along because she just loved the aesthetic and she loved the feel of the home itself. And she really was, obsessed with that hacienda style, the very Mexican, Central South American feel. She went down to Mexico and got a lot of the decorations from, they were legit. And, she was always ordering things. And when she did pass away, she actually had a lot of things that she had ordered that she hadn't been able to even, unbox. And she had a couch that she never got a chance to sit on because it was still in the box when the police, arrived at her home that fateful day. And as I said before, this is located in Brentwood, California. But it's a very secluded area. There's a lot of trees, a lot of big bushes surrounding it. So she definitely had kind of a little oasis in like the LA hubbub, which I think is really beautiful and very fitting of her. One thing that I do want to note as you see me start to work on this little patio area is I'll start putting around a lot of little potted plants. And I love that little that little aesthetic of having all of these potted plants. It's not full-on landscaping, these things are not in the ground. They're just these adorable little plants in pots. And to me, it's almost like the foreshadowing of domesticity. These may end up in the ground one day, they may not. But, for now, it was just kind of having them around. There's a lot of life in this house. And it's just a really cute aesthetic. I like the idea of all the potted plants. I think I might steal it for myself. Anyway, I chose this house for a few reasons. Of course, I like doing iconic historical builds. I like doing houses that are actually, reasonably playable, even though the Borden house, which I created last time, is not exactly what I'd call the most, inviting of player houses. But I've always felt kind of a little kindred with Marilyn. I think a lot of people say that. But for me, the reason I say that specifically is that having been a busty blonde actress myself at one point in my life, I feel kind of a kindred spirit with her. I think when a woman has a certain look about them, specifically when it comes to being on stage or on screen, you automatically get shoved into this little box. And Marilyn dealt with that her entire life. She was the blonde bombshell, and that trope 100% exists, and it still exists. I mean, at least it existed 10 years ago when I was trying to become an actor. And I'm not saying that I am particularly a blonde bombshell. It's just that curvy blonde ladies, you know, a lot of times get the short end of the acting stick. And I was always cast as the ditzy side character, the slut, for those uncouth individuals out there. And they were great roles, you know, they were really fun roles, really memorable roles. I really enjoyed it. But the sexy one, again, not saying I'm sexy, but it's just this, you know, trope they fit you into, because literally, like, if the shoe fits. Anyway, the sexy one never really gets to be the main character. That's not the aesthetic they're looking for. Like, they want main characters to be the girl next door. And the side characters, like Marilyn, you know, had a tendency to be, you know, kind of a supporting role character. Your look is too niche, I guess, or too dynamic to make you a leading lady. But speaking as a failed actor myself, which means that I totally have room to talk, I have to admit that I have personally always seen leading ladies as kind of boring. Especially that, like, traditional leading lady from, like, classic plays and musicals and things. They're always so nice and sweet and innocent and just way too good to exist. And it's your side characters that have all of these amazing personality flaws, and they're like the comic relief of the show. And I'm probably just saying that because I've always been the Miss Adelaide and the Rizzo of the theater world. But also, I'm not wrong. Anyway, moot point, because I definitely gave up my dream of being an actress, because it turns out I hate everything about it. Huh, who would have thought? Just to clarify, most actors are amazing people. They are artists in their own right. But to be a success, you know, in the acting world, in a lot of the art world, really, you have to have a certain level of narcissism about you, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But it can become a little much to constantly be enveloped by. And that narcissism is necessary, because what you're selling is pretty much yourself. Whenever you're an artist, yes, you are selling your craft, but you're also selling yourself as a person. And so you have to play yourself up as way better than you actually are, and I'm terrible at that. Like, my skill is self-deprecation. So, speaking of self-deprecation, at the build here, I wanted to leave this in just because it's happened to me a couple times, and I've seen a lot of people talk about it on, like, forums. The disappearing fence. I think it's because you leave move objects on when you're building. Sometimes when you put a gate on a fence, the fence will just disappear. And then you'll go to replace the fence that disappeared, and that fence will disappear. So I just wanted to say that if this has happened to anyone, all you have to do is close out of the game and open it back up again, and your fence will reappear. So if you do see that front gate, you know, with the weird floating invisible fence, it will return when, you know, I close out and come back to the build. Speaking of build, here we are. We've finally gotten into the interior. We are doing Marilyn's kind of iconic kitchen area. She had this beautiful, again, hacienda style, blue tiling everywhere. This was a little breakfast nook that technically had booths, like booths. It was a booth seating area, but I loved these orange chairs, so I decided to go with those. And she also had this beautiful range hood that stretched along like that, so, you know, I had to kind of combine those. Because it is this beautiful copper color with all of these pots and pans hanging from it. It's a really neat kitchen. And it's pretty unexpected for Marilyn. I think most people would think that Marilyn Monroe would have, you know, a kind of lavish, kind of in-your-face, feminine kind of house. When really, you know, it's a very organic, natural, rather, you know, genderless building. You know, I could see a man or a woman living here. And I think that's really cool. And she really, really loved this aesthetic. And as you can see, I have this red shelf. Anyone who watches other YouTube builders, which I'm pretty sure anyone that would be watching this will have watched other YouTube builders. But the red shelf is a great tool if you are using move objects and you're placing a lot of clutter around your build, which clutter, let's be real, makes the build. You know, it makes it look lived in, it makes it look more interesting and dynamic. And if you just, you know, unless you're going for that, like, minimalist look. So I did put this wall in, but I ended up changing it because it's definitely, she had like a blue tile that she had throughout her house. So I do change this to the blue kind of Tuscan feeling tile in the kitchen, and I believe I do in the bathrooms as well. So just really quickly, just because it's my MO, and these are historical builds, I did want to talk a little bit about Marilyn, the woman. I wanted to talk about who she was and, you know, why she became such an icon, how she became such an icon, and the things that you might not necessarily know about her. So she was born, of course, as Norma Jean. Mortensen is technically, I know some people have different, like Baker, and I've heard other last names for her, but from what I read, Mortensen is technically the name. Anyway, she was born on June 1st of 1926. She was actually born in Los Angeles. Her mother was involved in Hollywood. She was a film cutter, which was physically cutting like real film for back when real film was a thing. So she wasn't, you know, an actress of her own, in her own right, but she was still involved in the Hollywood lifestyle. And Marilyn had a very difficult, very, very, very difficult childhood. Her mother suffered from mental illness, and Marilyn jumped around foster home after foster home for basically 16 years of her life. She had, you know, went to tons of different schools. She never really had roots anywhere. She just bounced around, and she was sadly, tragically, the victim of sexual abuse in a lot of these homes. And that, I think is a core reason that Marilyn never really settled herself well. Because, you know, it was at a time when no one really talked about that. Not that people are great at talking about it now, but they're definitely better. But at that time, nobody talked about it. And so she never got the help that she needed. She was never able to settle that trauma inside herself. And, you know, she dealt with self-worth issues, which, you know, from outside looking in, you're like, how can Marilyn Monroe not think highly of herself? She's Marilyn frickin' Monroe. But no, she dealt with a lot of self-doubt and fear and abandonment issues. Of course you're going to have abandonment issues if you spend almost your entire life being consistently abandoned. So anyway, she was abused as a child. She was rootless in a lot of her childhood. And that led to her actually getting married very young, because she was going to go back into state care when her main care family moved out of state. And she knew a young man who lived in the town. He was a neighbor, and his name was Jim Dougherty. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he was 21 years old, and they got married on June 19th of 1942. So that was her first marriage, and it was a marriage to save her from going back into foster care. So, you know, it was a very kind thing to do, but her marriage to Jim wasn't, you know, it wasn't really a romantic one. I think there was a little romance there, and Marilyn herself said it wasn't a bad marriage. It just wasn't a marriage of love. It was kind of a marriage of necessity. And which, you know, was a kind thing to do, but kindness does not love make. You know, you can quote me on that. I mean, somebody else may have said that. Anyway. So she's married to Jim, and she drops out of high school because that's what you did, you know, in the 40s. You were a woman, and you got married, and you dropped out of high school, and you became a housewife. And she did, but Jim was shipped off to the Pacific Theater of World War II in 1944. So Marilyn actually started working at the Radio Plane Company in California, which was owned by Howard Hughes, by the way, as in The Aviator. But that was where she was discovered by a photographer who came to take pictures of women just to kind of boost morale and, you know, get women excited about helping with the war effort. And her life changed after that. That's when she really, you know, she decided to become a model. She bleached her hair for the first time because she thought that it would make her more noticeable and make her stand out. And yeah, that set her on the road towards fame. So we're going to take a break from Marilyn really quick and just talk about the build a little here. Here we are in the bathroom. Again, I do go in, and I use the blue tiles on the wall, but I actually change the floor to the blue tiles later as well. This is Marilyn's bedroom. Marilyn's bedroom was very sparsely decorated. And it was very white. It was a very, like, clean kind of room. I do have carpeting in it right now, but I end up changing that. And I'm not 100% sure if it was carpeted or not. If anyone knows, please let me know, and I can change it, make it more historically correct. But I also am working on the fireplace here, because Marilyn had these cool fireplaces in a couple areas. The one in the kitchen had beautiful tiling around the edge of it, but then she also had these kind of corner fireplaces that were made out of the same kind of stucco, adobe type material that the house itself is made out of. But I don't have a stove like that. There may be one in a pack I don't have, but I just tried to do the best that I could. You know, miff it a little, fudge it, fake it till you make it. That's the acting way. Which also I was really bad at. I'm really bad at, like, faking things. It's just because I'm awkward. Like, let's be real. It all comes down to because I'm awkward. But there are a couple of things in the build that didn't actually exist in her house. I'm not 100% sure if there was a bar in her living room, but I felt like it was fitting. I mean, you know, it's 1940s, 1950s Hollywood. Well, at this point, 1960s. But everybody had a bar. And I do end up going in and changing some of these, some of the furnishing off camera. Just because, you know, I'm constantly doing research for these builds. I'm constantly looking at pictures. And sometimes it can be a little overwhelming while you're actually doing the build and looking at your reference pictures. And you have to take a step back and look at your pictures and say, oh, I didn't notice that these chairs were this style. And, you know, this tile was this color and that kind of thing. There's a lot of little notes. And I miss a lot of them, you know. But I try and get it as best I can. So this bathroom, again, it had that beautiful tiling in it. And her shower around it was like this bright yellow. It was really cool, and it had that tile detailing to it. So jumping back, you know, while I'm finishing up some of the interior here into Marilyn's life. Marilyn, actually, after Jim was shipped off to World War II and she was discovered, she actually met Ben Lyon, who was the head of casting of 20th Century Fox. And he is the one who gave her her new name, which is Marilyn, after Marilyn Miller, the Broadway star, and Monroe, which was actually her mother's maiden name. And Jim was adamantly against all of this. He couldn't see his wife working, let alone being a model. And Marilyn's answer to this, which I'm low-key kind of obsessed with the fact that, you know, her answer to that was she divorced him. She was like, all right, bye. Which is kind of like, you know, oh, he did this great thing for you. But then again, you should never live your life indebted to anybody. That's no way to live. Live your life for yourself. You know, be nice, be kind, be empathetic, but never live your life because you feel like, you know, you need to do something for someone else. Anyway, Marilyn's career, it took a while to take off, but she was very set on becoming a star. She never lost sight of her vision. So even though she was on like government assistance, you know, at times she did nude modeling, at least once. She made her way up and she eventually was able to sign a big contract with Fox. And that's what led her to, you know, her most iconic roles in like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and How to Marry a Millionaire. And, you know, eventually led her into the arms of Joe DiMaggio of the New York Yankees, who she married on January 14th of 1954. So they were married in San Francisco, and they have a pretty well-documented tumultuous relationship. He had anger issues and alcohol issues, and she had issues of her own. Let us not, you know, place blame only on one person. I mean, he was an abusive asshole. Let's butthole. Can I bleep that? I don't know. He was an abusive butthole, but, you know, she was dealing with her own traumas. They both were. But, so they divorced, and they divorced pretty much almost right after the 7-Year Itch started filming, because Marilyn did her famous, you know, subway grate scene where her skirt flies up while she's above that subway grating, and DiMaggio was just appalled that, you know, his wife was like letting people look up her skirt. And that, yeah, so they divorced shortly after that, which, whatever, Joe DiMaggio, like, get over yourself. No, he ended up doing a lot better. He ended up kind of redeeming himself in the end, so stay tuned for that. But anyway, Marilyn took off to New York City and decided that she wanted to be more serious with her acting. She didn't just want to be that blonde bombshell anymore. She wanted to be celebrated for her talent, not just her beauty. And so she moved to New York City, and this was around the time that she met Arthur Miller, who was a playwright. And an interesting note about Arthur Miller, well, there are a couple interesting notes. I've seen a lot of interviews with him about Marilyn, and his opinion of Marilyn is such a tragically beautiful opinion, because, you know, I think that he saw a truth in Marilyn that a lot of people didn't see. He said that she was, of course, the most beautiful person you've ever seen. She was striking, and her personality was infectious, but there was a darkness to her. And he said, that's why I fell in love with her. There was this layer that was deep deep inside that he could see in her eyes. And I just thought that was really beautiful that, you know, even though their relationship wasn't perfect and it wasn't, you know, the best and they didn't stay together, spoilers, but, I think that the fact that he saw that in her, I think that she really was drawn to him because of that, because he saw her as more than she was. But he also wanted that blonde bombshell as well as this kind of tragic figure. So anyway, the FBI actually urged Marilyn Monroe not to marry not to marry Arthur Miller, not because he was married at the time, but because they thought he was a communist. So remember, kids, better dead than red. But she ended up marrying Miller after her and DiMaggio split, and Miller divorced his wife. So they were married in 1956. And, you know, throughout her life, Marilyn suffered from a lot of chronic illnesses, not just, you know, PTSD from all of the trauma she went through in her childhood, but she had endometriosis, which led to a lot of miscarriages throughout her life. And she had severe depression, which directly led to substance dependency. She began using barbiturates for insomnia, and that dependency just kind of grew throughout her life. And her mental health started to deteriorate. Well, I mean, you know, understandably so. She never got real help for it. You know, women didn't get the help that they needed at that time. And so she was known for being kind of erratic, and people didn't really like working with her that much. And it's a pretty well-known fact that Truman Capote, who wrote Breakfast at Tiffany's, actually wanted Marilyn Monroe to play the part of Holly Golightly. But that role went to Audrey Hepburn because the studio was afraid of Marilyn and her erratic behavior and what that would mean for the actual shooting of the movie. So, it was, I think, 1962. After a brief hiatus, Marilyn finally came back to Hollywood after she divorced Arthur Miller after the wrapping of the movie The Misfits, a movie that Arthur Miller wrote specifically to help Marilyn bust out of her blonde bombshell kind of parts. But they ended up getting divorced shortly after The Misfits came out. And in 1962, that was the year that she famously went to Madison Square Garden and sang "Happy Birthday" to President Kennedy. And the dress that she wore during that sold for $4.8 million. I believe that's, you know, it might have been a little bit more than that, but a dress, like that's one dress, sold for $4.8 million. I mean, I get it. That is an iconic dress. It's beautiful, and it was meant to make her look like she was covered, like she was nude, but was covered in rhinestones. And, I mean, it worked. Like, the effect worked. She looked so good. Girl, I see you. Anyway. So Marilyn moved into this house in the early 60s, and she never really got a chance to fully furnish it, you know, as I mentioned before, because she didn't live here that long. And it was in 1962 that her housekeeper Eunice called Ralph Greenson, Marilyn Monroe's psychiatrist, at 3 a.m. on August 5th, 1962, because Marilyn was locked in her bedroom and Eunice couldn't get a response. And Greenson broke in through the window of her bedroom, which I actually showed briefly in that little intro video, I believe, and found her on her bed. And her personal physician was then called, and Marilyn was pronounced dead at 3:50 a.m. According to the autopsy, Marilyn Monroe died between 8 and 10 p.m. on the evening of August 4th, 1962, from acute barbiturate poisoning. So, lacking any evidence to the contrary, they classified her death as probable suicide. She had overdosed in the past. She had been hospitalized for her drug usage. She had gone to detox. So it was kind of accepted that her overdose was, if not intentional, you know, it was still self-induced. And, you know, her death was front-page news. Like, it rocked the Western world because she was an icon. She was an icon. The American icon. You know, coming from nothing and becoming, you know, as recognizable as Elvis or Mickey Mouse. And I think that while, you know, her death was tragic, I think that it's really amazing what she was able to do. She was a businesswoman and a shrewd thinker, a dedicated actress, and the greatest of success stories. And she is and will always be an American icon, and she has made a legacy worth remembering. And she had such, you know, a tragic time of it, and I just want to be like, girl, you did it, and we see you, and we love you. Anyway, here we are at the end of the build. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a little bit and that you enjoyed what I created and that I did Marilyn justice by recreating this beautiful home. Like and subscribe my channel if you would like more historical builds and little tidbits into their lives. And yeah, oh, this is available on the gallery to download, so please check me out. ItsLoolyLoo is my name on all social media, including the gallery. So thank you so much for coming, for tuning in and stopping by. Have a wonderful day. I love you. Bye.